1 minute has passed, so let me start the procedure of opening of the International Scientific and Diplomatic Congress, Yalta Peace, Historical Experience and Prospects. I will introduce myself. I am Vice Chairman of the Crimea Council of Ministers and permanent representative of the Republic of Crimea to the President of the Russian Federation, Georgy Muradov. I have the honor to open the Congress and the first session, which is called the Historic Meaning of Yalta Conference and Yalta Peace. But before we start the first session, I have an important mission, an honorable task to read the welcoming letters to our Congress. These letters have come from many representatives of the leaders of different federal and regional institutions, but as I am representing the Republic of Crimea, I would like to start with the address by the head of the Republic of Crimea, Mr. Aksionov, who, addressing the members of the International Scientific and Diplomatic Congress dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the Yalta Conference and foundation of UN and UNESCO, says that 35 years ago here at hospitable Crimean land took part a historic conference of the leaders of the three parties who not only managed to coordinate the final destroyment of the Nazi Germany, but also they created the principles of the post-war world order. As never before, the world is needing for the fair interests of the peoples and nations, and the Yalta Conference of the leaders of anti-Hitler coalitions can be an example, and this conference created the unprecedented principles of the World Organization for the next 75 years, and we as contemporaries should take into account the experience of the Yalta Conference. Thanks to it, modern humanity can create more sustainable international communications. The breakthrough character of this conference was supported by the victorious success of the Red Army in the ending of the World War II. Today, in a challenging international situation, we are facing the issue of survival of our civilization, the Russian world, and maintaining the consistency of the states which were created on the Russian land. And this situation demands self-sacrifice similar to the one they demonstrated in 1945. And maybe the International Scientific and Diplomatic Congress will find the ways to solve the modern issues. I wish you all the success in this honorable mission, Sergei Aksionov. We also have an interest from the chairman of the State Council of the Republic of Crimea, Vladimir Konstantinov. Dear friends and colleagues, I am glad to greet this Congress dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the Yalta Conference, to this historic event which took place in our land. Today, as never before in the last 75 years, we need this wise ways of finding the solutions to the most challenging problems of the world, which was given a flawless demonstration during the Yalta Conference. It's obvious that the principles of world order are still workable. At least we have not invented anything better during this last 75 years. And now when the world is steeped in problems and feels the global political instability, the Yalta Conference is more and more quoted as a safe haven, which we should probably try to come back to. And this probably will be the main issue of your discussion, and these issues are sought after, and it's not by chance that this is taking part here, because in Crimea we say that the wars don't start in Crimea, they end in the Crimea. This happened in the middle of the 19th century when the blizzards died down during the Eastern Crimean War, and 75 years ago. And Yalta Conference is not the first line which is drawn between the bloodshed and the peaceful times. And I'm sure that the end of the contemporary Cold War, which is imposed on Russia, will end here. There is little possibility that the new meeting of the leaders of the 5 member states of the UN Security Council, which was proposed by our president, will take place here, but not everybody is ready to come to the terms with the historical reality and accept our right to define our own fate. We will have to work here a lot, but even today Crimea can become a place of an active scientific research for the basics and principles of a more fair and sustainable world order, and the place where we cherish the memory of our military and diplomatic victories, and we will not let anybody to misrepresent them. I'm sure that your forum is the first step towards it, and we will not limit ourselves with this one step, but we will go the full way to create the new methods of safer words and world safety. And I wish you successful, fruitful work, and with such addresses we are starting already to introduce the main themes into our discussion. I also have an address towards the participants of the Congress from the chairman of the Crimea Legislative Assembly of the second federal entity in the Crimea, the city of Sevastopol. Ladies and gentlemen, the geographic and historical space of Sevastopol, its 1,000-year experience, leaves us with a certain responsibility. Our duty is to maintain and to multiply the heritage we have received. The power that is leading the Sevastopol gives us hope and the feeling of belonging to the city of Sevastopol. As it is well known, Catherine the Great called our city worthy of deference. But why did she say so about a city whose fame was yet to come? What was worth of deference here at this place where there were very few citizens at that time? The centuries of the first few years of Christianity, St. Andrew, Cyril and Methodius, planted the seeds of orthodoxy, which strengthened the spirit of the Russian land, and this spirit helped Saint Vladimir to make his historic choice, baptizing Russia and unifying the Slavonic peoples and creating the national unity. Our city is called the Patriotic capital of Russia. Here each stone is breathing with history. There are thousands of lives were sacrificed here. Many tourists coming to Sevastopol are surprised with the level of historical knowledge of our children, and our young people are active patriots. I think this can be explained by our traditions of upbringing young civilians when from the very childhood we educate them in the spirit of duty, courage and honesty and dignity. In Sevastopol we see deep patriotic feelings and historic feeling of belonging to this land. All of this makes us feel an integral part of the Russian civilization, and this feeling supported us during the 23 years within the territory of another state and helped us to come out to MGIMO Square 6 years ago, and there we voiced our decision to restore the historic fairness and to come back home to our historical roots. This decision was made with our witnessing and by our own hands, and such kind of congresses where we can listen to scientists acknowledged all over the world will allow us to create the strategy of cooperation and to once more voice our national values and tradition. Our main task for today is to create the future and to be thankful and to remember the past, and to those people who created us as a unified nation within one country. This is signed by the chairman of the Legislative Assembly, Mr. Nemtsov. We also have an address by the rector of Moscow State University of International Affairs, Academician Tokonov. I am glad to welcome you at the opening of the Yalta Conference Historic Experience and Prospects. This year we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the great victory, which was only possible due to the common effort of the nations of anti-Hitler coalition, despite all the political and ideological discrepancies between them. The Yalta Conference made the basis of the post-war world, which helped to avoid the nuclear catastrophe. Despite all the drawbacks of the system, I may say that it was much more effective than the Versailles Washington world order which existed before the war. The Yalta world order helped us to avoid a hot major conflict, and it survived within the next 50 years. 30 years have passed since the new world order has replaced it, but the values of the Yalta world order is still on demand among the countries who are responsible for the fate of the humanity in order to overcome the worsening chaos in world economy. Eurasian Economic Commission, represented by the academic board chairman and the minister in charge of integration and macroeconomics, Sergei Glazyev, also sent us an address, and they say that the world, in the world history this year will be remembered as a the anniversary year of the historic Yalta Conference, which created the basis of the post-war world order. And International Scientific and Diplomatic Congress is dedicated to this anniversary. I will now only read some parts because there are very many addresses. The historic experience of the Yalta Peace and the strategies of creating a multipolar world on the basis of cooperation will be in the focus of this discussion. And the participants will see how Crimea was at the springhead of the Russian civilization, and you will see the role of the Russian scientists in the developing the strategies of overcoming the global crisis and creating this sustainable non-spheric civilization. And the materials will be scrutinized by the Eurasian Economic Commission and will be used in the further work to create a long-term strategy of the Eurasian Economic Commission and its cooperation with China.
Andrei
Belianinov, Secretary General of the Eurasian People's Assembly, writes that the Eurasian People's Assembly pays a lot of attention towards the maintaining of historical truth, and the priority of our activity is peace building and refocusing the attention from the international threats towards universal basic human values, focused on peaceful initiative, spiritual harmony, and international communication. That's why we called the Congress dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the victory, which took part in September here in Vorontsovsky Palace, was provided under the motto "Let's protect the truth about the victory." The key issue of all the sessions of the forum was the historical truth and about the historical fight against fascism. And the Eurasian People's Assembly hopes that our Congress and similar activities by other organizations have laid the strong foundation for the International Scientific and Diplomatic Congress and will create the basics for the humanistic non-spheric civilization and sustainable multipolar peace on the basis of the role of the United Nations to overcome the international crisis and to strengthen the well-being of the states. We are sure that such congresses will help to achieve sustainable peace and to maintain historical truth. And this period of political warfare should be replaced by the period of peaceful coexisting of different nations. The rector of the Crimea Federal University, Andrei Vladimirovich, says that this Congress is intended to find the new way to establish the well-being and economical and political safety, which is very important for very countries, and partnership of science will help us to discuss the work of United Nations and UNESCO, which is an important tool in the globalization. And for the Crimean Federal University, it's an incredibly important event which will make a very valuable input for the further fruitful activities. This year has brought new worldwide challenges like the COVID pandemic, and we are facing the disconnection of people, which is necessary to prevent the spread of the viruses. And this has shown us that the main value in this world is the possibility to communicate with your relatives and like-minded people. We are missing the traditional ways of sharing the opinions, and we are happy to take part in such an event as we are seeing today. Another greeting from the Executive Secretary of the Commission of the Russian Federation on the UNESCO activities, Mr. Chernykidze, the Ambassador at Large of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He highlights that the 75th anniversary of Yalta Conference and foundation of United Nations and UNESCO is based on the scientific analysis of the experience of the Second World War and the post-war world order. And this conference had established the principle for the next several decades, and it's a good idea to revise those principles in order to speak about our future, especially in such a turbulent situation and instability, growing instability. Especially in the conditions of a new humanitarian challenge of the pandemic, which is critically changing the way we live and which is also demanding the strengthening of the solidarity. It's absolutely necessary to use the peace-building potential of UNESCO and to use it for the best of all the states and peoples. During the years of its existence, UNESCO has established itself as a unique multilateral forum which allows to protect the universal values and cultural heritage and ecology, and which says that the peaceful coexistence should not be based on military and political mechanisms, but on the moral solidarity of peoples. We are welcoming the input of the Russian scientific community into finding the ways of overcoming the instability and the strategies of the future world order and the strategies of implementing those ideas. We also have a letter from the Under-Secretary General for Legal Affairs in the United Nations, Miguel de Serpa Suarez. He thanks Yuri Yakovets for the invitation, and he says that in this historical 75th anniversary of the Yalta Conference and Foundation of the United Nations, he underlines his commitment towards its principles in the charity of the United Nations organizations. I would like to ask some of our volunteers to come up and take my phone. I cannot fail to congratulate you, the International University named after Lomonosov and Sorokin Institute and the Moscow Institute of Foreign Affairs for your commitment in supporting those values, and I wish you all the success in the provision of this important Congress. Dear guests, so you can see how much attention we are receiving, though we are really gathered here in very unique conditions of world pandemic, and there are very few of us present here, but there are a lot of people who are analyzing, who are not deprived of the possibility to provide deep assessment of what's going on. Unfortunately, today we are not only limited by the pandemic, which is separating us from each other, but we are also dehumanized by using all these resources which are influencing you any moment. They are calling you any moment, and if we are speaking about the young people, unfortunately sometimes their conscience is created by someone else. And today we should objectively analyze the reality and provide our recommendations, which will be used at all the levels, at the level of the Russian Federation and at the level of international institutions, including the United Nations organization. I would like to thank everybody present here for the fact that despite all these barriers, you have found the possibility to come and to take part in our discussion, and I believe that many important and respectful colleagues will take part in a video conference, which is not though it is not the usual communication, but still is possible in our times. But I believe that time will come when we will be able to gather together with all the peace activists in order to find diplomatic and scientific solutions of the modern problems. With your permission, I would like to open the first session, the historical meaning of the Yalta Conference and Yalta Peace. And I would like to give floor to the director of the Institute of Europe and corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Science, but I'm sure that Alexei Gromyko, the grandchild of Andrei Gromyko, whom you remember well enough, and I believe that he will become a full member of the Russian Academy of Science. And Alexei, I'm giving you the floor. I will pass you the microphone. Dear Mr. Muradov, dear colleagues and friends, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, first of all Yuri Yakovets, for the invitation. During the last years and decades, he has made a huge input not only into the civilization science, but also into our understanding of the major events in the 20th and 21st, and I'm sure that in the 22nd century people will remember the events which took place in the Crimea in 1945. The first session is dedicated to the history, but I'm sure that each speaker will try to connect this history with the modern days and probably with the future. You can see that in different wordings of the speeches, the word combination of Yalta Peace, Yalta World Order, historical breakthrough, historical heritage of Yalta, the key towards world policy, and so on. So we did not communicate with each other about it, but we were as if competing with each other in trying to choose the most accurate words to show our attitude towards what happened in Yalta in February 1945, the second meeting after the Tehran of the Big Three. We all hoped to meet together in Levaden Palace, but both Vorontsovsky and Yusupovsky palaces played an important role, being the residences of the two other leaders of the Big Three. But still, we are not far from Levadia, not far from Yalta, and the spirit is felt, and we are surrounded and immersed into the feeling of that time and the glory and the wise decisions that were taken at that time. My theme is dedicated not only to Yalta, but to the events which took place before and after that conference. And Yalta is one of the units in the chain of the thought which was developing very fast and rapidly in Moscow and in London and in Washington, the strategic thinking without which the world will be very different. I would not say that this world would not exist, but it would be very, very different, and most probably with all the dark pages of the post-war history, it would be probably not so good. The 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War certainly reminds about the huge events which were the foundations for the new world. Those parameters of Yalta-Potsdam system of international communications, which replaced the Versailles-Washington system, provided the stability of international communications for decades ahead. And up to now, the consequences of the decisions which were taken by the Big Three in Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam at the conferences, and the decisions which were taken afterwards, created the realities of the security policy in which we are living. The heritage of the winners is defined by the strategic decision to create a universal international structure which will support peace and security. This is the United Nations organization. This was the second creation of the UNESCO, which played very important role in the second half of the 20th century. And it's incredibly interesting to study the heritage of the whole decade of the 40s. And we have a very important issue at stake: how to restore the international communication between the world leaders, how not to allow the new stage of the Cold War and to avoid any kind of hot conflicts. And I invite you to take a look at our past which will be developed by the further speaker. Let's remember that the political leadership of the United States, Mr. Roosevelt, had very strong intuition and the understanding of the internal motivations of the USSR, and internally the White House was very much prepared for the dialogue with Moscow at the very beginning of the World War II, especially after the attack of Japan on Pearl Harbor and the development of events at the Eastern Front. In December 1941, the leaders of the presidential administration said that the Roosevelt course will be focused on the development of the relationships with the USSR, and this course was to be based on the avoidance of trying to make the other side work as they were seeing it, of imposing any kind of ideas. But they could not avoid taking into account the growing role of the USSR, not only on the external, but also on the internal policy of the United States. In 1944, before the presidential elections in the United States, the Soviet ambassador in Washington received a confidential visit from Thomas Lamont, a famous financial guru. He was the head of the Morgan's house, and after this visit, after his talk with the ambassador, it was found out that he was a person from the Republican Party, and his unusual offering was to ask the USSR to support Thomas Dewey, the Republican candidate in the presidential elections. This fact became obvious because Stalin and Roosevelt had very trusting relationships, but the role of the ambassador was to say that the USSR is not interfering with the internal affairs of the United States. From our days, we can only be surprised with such turns in history when we are always blamed about involving into the internal affairs of the USA, when the influence of the Russian Federation on the United States is often overrated. On the 1st of February 1942, 26 states signed the Declaration of the United Nations, in which for the first time this broad combination, the United Nations, was used. The Soviet diplomacy took the most active part in creating and negotiating the wording of this document, and which became the formal document of the anti-Hitler coalition. In October 1943, Moscow became the place where the ideas of the Big Three for the further development of the world order after the war received the first real implementations. This was a conference of the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, which took place in Moscow, and there they created a declaration of 4 states on the international security issues. It included also China. This declaration, which quoted the declaration of the United Nations organization, this declaration maintains the main principles of the UN. The United States became the part which has introduced the project of the declaration of the 4 states on the universal security, and Molotov on behalf of the USSR offered an idea to create a commission of 3 superpowers to develop the issues of creating an international organization which will support international peace and security. Creating the principles of the post-war world order, the big 3 started to prepare for the conference in Tehran, which had to take place in December 1943. There, in the capital of Iran, Roosevelt continued to develop his concept of 4 policemen, the USSR, the USA, the UK and China, but the USSR was not sure of this idea. We had the doubts whether such an organization will be supported by small countries. Stalin was concerned about the behavior and the influence of small countries on the United States. Later on, the idea of a new universal organization had become the key issue for the diplomacy of the USSR, and this idea was implemented in creating such an institute as the United Nations, the nuclear of the Security Council, and after Tehran conference in Moscow and in Washington, there was held a parallel work on creating the principles of the organizations which had to become a heritage of League of Nations. And I would like to mention a few ideas. First of all, they achieved the understanding on the western borders of the USSR. First of all, this was the Soviet Poland border, the Cursor line, including the western Ukraine and Belarus into the USSR, and this understanding showed that in the post-war world the allies had the full right to strengthen their security, including the territorial issues as they saw them in the light of the lessons of the First and Second World Wars. And such an approach of the Big Three was developed later on in the Crimea and in Potsdam. In Potsdam, where they fixed the western border of Poland. And it's important to mention that big territorial advances of Poland in its west have become possible thanks to the fact that in Potsdam the USSR made important concessions to the USA in the reparation of Germany. The liberation of Poland from the fascists cost the USSR the lives of 600,000 soldiers and officers. But in Potsdam, after the end of the war, Moscow was trying to find compromises to help Poland. In the post-war world, after the Tehran, there was a conference, there were several conferences in Washington, in San Francisco, in Potsdam, and in Yalta, and the role of the USSR in the creation of the post-war peace was based on the fact that all the discussions were provided on the basis of the Soviet proposals. This was a norm of that time, and one of the evidences of the fact that the USSR was hoping for the long-lasting and friendly relationships with the USA is well known to specialists, but not to the wide audience. The position of Moscow in San Francisco conference on the place where the headquarters of the United Nations should be placed, Moscow supported the idea to place this headquarters not in Europe but in the USA, and the Russian diplomats were voting for San Francisco, and starting from August 1945, while they were preparing the commission of the United Nations in London. But what about London and Paris? Among the different cities of the old world, they discussed Copenhagen, Geneva, and others, but I think that the key interest was in the motivation of our position. Why we were not agreeing with Paris or London. In Moscow, they believed that the headquarters, that this step will allow the USA not to go away from the alliance as it happened in 1918, and to keep the role of one of the centers of power, and certainly as in spring 1945 Moscow was ready to confront the United States and to push them away from the international policy. This would contradict the idea of the headquarters being in Europe instead of the United States. The meeting in Potsdam analyzed the results of the World War II and became the starting point of the new page in international relationships. I would like to mention once more that the United Nations Organization chart was signed in San Francisco in 1945, and I would like to say that the conference started working in April, and on the first day of its work there happened another historic event. This was the meeting of the Russian and American troops on the Elba in Germany, and before this meeting had such a huge psychological value that even in 2020, despite all the hardships in the communications between the USA and Russia, the two presidents decided to work in the spirit of the Elbe River. In the end, I would like to say that the year of the 75th anniversary of the foundation of the United Nations, we should highlight the incredible input of all the conferences of the Big Three into the world construction, and the declaration is put in the Charter of the United Nations to spare the future generations from the calamities of war. And first of all, we are speaking not about regional wars, but the big Third World War. And this aim has been fulfilled up to now, at least. We have managed to avoid the World War III. And it's also important to speak about the future, and in order to let the Cold War to start growing, there were some very objective reasons. The history unfortunately took up the unfortunate scenario, but I think that this doesn't mean that the events could only go this way. I think that it is hard to fix the beginning and the end of the Cold War at some certain year, 1945, 46 or 47. We can say that the Cold War started in March 1946 when Churchill gave his speech, or probably even earlier, on the 23rd of April 1945, when Truman, in a very rude way, had a meeting with Molotov in Washington, and unlike this, the beginning and the end of any other military action, the participants were involved into the Cold War step by step, and I think that it is probably wiser to say that the beginning and the end of the Cold War can be shown by a period, by some periods. For example, the beginning from 1945 to 1949, when the NATO was created. And I think this approach will be more justified than just starting the Cold War by separate events and actions, but by the processes of creating structures of political and military conflicts. So the start of this period, 1945, has some first signs of the Cold War, and later on these signs are becoming more and more weighty, and by the end of 1940s this potential has been implemented, and the Cold War became inevitable. But neither before nor after, the United Nations, the main child of the Big Three, played an exclusive role in the softening and mitigating and regulating and avoiding the major world crisis. Just remember the year 1962, the way in which the United Nations acted in order to help Moscow and Washington to come to terms. The Cold War has not become the end of the partnership of the Big Three, and I think this is proved by the huge efforts which were taken by these countries in order to overcome the Cold War in 1960s, 70s and 80s. And I believe that the period of disarmament had not only the potential to temporarily stop the to temporarily soften the situation, but the potential to stop the Cold War. But this is also a subject for a bigger discussion, and I will end up with the words that the history shows objective conditions that existed during the World War II and after it, and this is true for the evaluation of the possibility of cooperation of Russia, the USA, the European Union, China, and other powers that are acting in our days. And there are some chances for the positive cooperation, including the case if we remember and don't forget and try to follow the lessons and the experience that we have gained, the strategic thinking that was elaborated during the war years and that has been demonstrated in February 1945 in Yalta. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Коллеги, это глубокий научный доклад. Я вот
This is a very interesting scientific report, and I believe that for us,
принимать какие-то действия,
diplomats, if you don't know, I'm coming from a diplomatic sphere. It is important for us to deeply know the contents, and our scientists should keep up the level of diplomatic cooperation, and I am very happy that we are working both in terms of science and diplomacy, and I'm happy that this Congress is uniting two major directions. I have read the agenda of the Yalta Conference 1945. Of the conference we had that had been prepared for this conference, but unfortunately all this is changed by the pandemic. But nevertheless, the main vector of intellectual work we will keep up in full scale. I have to apologize that the Republic of Crimea had to limit some cultural events and to close the concert halls and to change the wonderful agenda we had. But this is due to extraordinary circumstances we are meeting in. And I have to apologize for you for that. And secondly, please don't think that I have gained the whole power. Together with Mikhail Ageev, the director of Pitirim Sorokin Institute, will tell you, I also have the permission to give floor to one more participant of our conference. Here we have a representative of Mr. Glaziev and assistant of the Minister of the Eurasian Economic Commission, Sergei. A wonderful scientist and practitioner. So I give floor to Dmitry Mityaev, the assistant of the minister. You're welcome. Thank you very much for such an interesting possibility to speak at this conference.
Я постараюсь больше про геоэкономику говорить, поскольку сам экономист. Но тем не менее должен сказать, что
should say that From the point of view of the theory of long waves, and we here work in scientific paradigm. This is not the first time when Eurasia becomes important in international agenda, and once in a few hundred years such waves come back, and we remember the times of Alexander Macedonsky, then the times of Christianity, and now we have the next wave that is, unfortunately, or probably objectively, is coming to its end. And really, in fact, the Yalta Peace nearly immediately turned into Cold War. And from the ideological point of view, that's pretty understandable. And it's wonderful that such a construction should have been very, very strong to exist for the next several decades. We know all the geopolitical theories, and there is a tradition of and Serbia and Russia is existing in the northern part of paradigm of these waves. And in fact, in my opinion, coming back to the price we paid for the Yalta Peace, the fourth power, the fourth basis of the Yalta Conference was the victorious base of the Red Army in Eastern Germany. And the idea to get as soon as possible towards La Manche. Nevertheless, and later on, the nuclear parity was also very important for this system. Nevertheless, the economic values were signed in the later on conferences, but the Soviet Union, though it signed the documents, it has not ratified them, despite of the fact that there were some connections, and we were the member of the predecessor of the World Trade Organization and the predecessor of the World Bank. We did not take part due to the Marshall Plan, and we didn't connect ruble with the dollar, and that was the basics of the system at that moment, when all the currencies had to be connected with the gold and dollar standard. The USSR aligned rubles with the gold, and the post-war economy was based on the idea that we are ready to work separately as in 1930s, and to have our own economical policy, and to print as many rubles as we need, and the inflation and the periodical reduction of prices, all this created our economy. And all this came to its end, and it's an important lesson for us here. When the Yalta Peace saw some very important drawbacks, and the first time it was the consequences of creating NATO, and the USSR had to create a buffer zone in the countries where we said that socialism had won, but still a very important event happened in the end of 1950s. it was very important to cooperate
Советского Союза с
with the newly created Chinese Republic, where we have launched a lot of technologies, a lot of new plants, and we provided for the startup of a new state. I would like to ask, I would say a few words about the further development. All of you know pretty well that there was an effort to give economical reasoning for the Yalta Peace Treaty. We know that in the 1970s there was a conflict with Western Germany. There were technologies that, and at that moment the European elite was more or less adequate, but the main issue was that the USSR became the energy appendix to Western and Eastern Europe, and started to exploit its gas and oil possibilities, and that we tried to, unfortunately we denied a number of very important internal technological issues such as internal digitalization, but where are we now in the result of this? In principle, we can see that Eurasia is the most important economical player if we are speaking about the rhythms, and the Germany is the leader. Nevertheless, we can see that the modern financial systems were actually started there 76 years ago, and it has been developing all this time, and it has come through different stages, but still the foundations are the same. And here, as in the peace and war system, here we have the capitalization and the debts. The capitalization of Russia is nearly not seen here. China is also very, very small, but Japan and Western countries are prevailing here. So what is happening next? Nevertheless, we are having two different ways, and the splits in the development of the Yalta world order have become quite acute. The level of inequality between East and West, North and South, if we can say that in Africa there are no riches despite of the very huge resources, and in Asia we see that we have created Anglo-Saxon institutions. In Asia we see that Asia is still in subordinate position. We don't have, but we have a very different picture in the West. It's also a very long wave. It started at the beginning of the 19th century when the Asian countries created 2/3 of the world economy, and later on we created, there was the development of capitalism. And about 60% of the British success were the riches that were taken from India, from China, and all this is coming back now. We are in the middle of the 20th century. There is a conditional but very particular from the financial and informational point of view. We could see the prevalence of the West, and gradually it is diminishing. And we can see the numbers of this year in the financially developed countries. We can see that the drop is higher than, is more dramatic than even in our country. And we can see that the dynamics, the positive trends are shown here. And it will play if the Americans will not use any power to enforce their rate. And we can also see that there is an effort to create a united continent, and 20 years ago we saw it in the West, then it was supported by our businessmen. This was called the Trans-Eurasian way of development. We are starting to implement that step by step. For example, the trains which are going towards and back from China have developed during the 5 years, and the speed has grown up to 5 days. And this is still developing, because in the past traditions of geopolicy, who is the host of the sea, that country is providing control. China is very vulnerable here, but there is an effort to come back to Trans-Eurasian model. Here we can see nearly the same trade. What happened in Russia several years ago as a big European partnership integration. We were speaking about integration, and the Eurasian Economical Union and other institutes, and the cooperation in the sphere of safety. All this can be seen within one big system of cooperation, and here I'm coming to an end, and we can see here that on the one hand there is the construction of Eurasian Economical Union, the unified economical space, and the 4 freedoms, the capital and the workforce, and all this is developing, and certainly this all should have some technological basis, because if we work like in 1920s, when we just miss one of the technological stages, we will get the chance not to invest into the old kinds of technologies and to switch on to biotechnologies. In nanotechnologies we have some examples of collaborations, but we don't have any success here. Also, I have shown you the technology of Nikolay Ageev, the different matrices for the economical ideas of Russia and China, and here we can see that there are some points where we can match, and there are some points where we can cooperate. And I would like to say in the end that we are still providing in the 20th century. We are providing for our own organizations, like Soviet and the Eurasian organizations. And that was possible because at the beginning of the century we had some intellectual advantage, and this helped us to implement some ideas starting from Tsiolkovsky, and this brought us to the fact that there was a very solid foundation for the world order that had been discussed in Yalta by the Big Three. At that moment, our country was developing very rapidly, and we knew why we were doing that, and we knew why we needed this freedom and independence. And I think that today we should come back to that approach. And then the 21st century could be a continuation of the Yalta world order, and we have a huge way to work, because this old world order, economical order, will come to its end. And there are different ideas of what can come to replace it. And the general economic plan has one in China, India and other countries. And there are some institutes which allow these trends to develop, and we will see that. And we know that the West will not give up their power for nothing. And we know that such changes of power have also been provided through world wars, and when the capitals had to be distributed to the new directions, they went from the former leader. And this hardly happens in a peaceful way. So I think that it's important for us to rethink the ways of such changes in the spirit of Yalta Peace Treaty, and with our partners and competitors and friends in the West, and we have some common grounds for discussion. Of course, there is an effort to speak about the heritage, and we should probably de facto say that the Yalta World Order has come to its end, and we are living in the situation where the treaties and the arrangements are not working anymore. Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to remind you that we have created the recommendations. You have them in the little red suitcases. We are not just sharing our opinions, but we are basing on the work which has been provided, the work on collecting unique documents, and we are going on with our work on a colossal monumental monography. We have started it yesterday. The Crimean stage in Sevastopol. There was a big lecture by Sergei Glaziev, and we also provided a session for young people, and we provided a military strategic game where the students were turned into Roosevelt, Stalin, Truman and Churchill, and they played brilliantly, and the boy who was playing Stalin actually played absolutely amazing, and later on they were turned into Terrorist, Sedapin, and all this is recorded, and before that we provided a game Unthinkable about the plan which was created in the UK, and we spoke about the scenarios and the possibilities to work with such secrets which are only unveiled now, and so we can work in different ways, and we can be in the very center of such different projects. And the report of Georgy Muradov is called The Crimean Key to World Policy. Thank you very much. Before I start my speech, I would like to say that the main issue for us is what we want to discuss and what kind of discussion of results we would like to achieve. I would like to ask everybody to limit their speeches with 15 minutes. Is it enough? Let us try to... I would try to respect this limit. If I don't, please interrupt me. And I would like to mention here Yakov Ketlin, a famous politologist who will join us by phone. Unfortunately, it was impossible to establish a video conference, but we will provide telecommunication. So, in the agenda, the list of speakers is given in alphabetical order, but we are working as a live conference, and if you allow, I will speak more as a practitioner than a scientist. I have been involved in practical, diplomatic and international and partly political work for the last 40 years, and I would probably try to introduce some very practical propositions, and if our forum believes that this might be introduced into the resolutions, I will welcome that. We are speaking a lot about Yalta, and it's understandable because after the war, Yalta has become the turning point, and I don't want us to see Yalta as the key point after the war. Let us look at it. Let us try to look at all the issues we had before the war. As many politologists believe, and many politicians of modern world believe, the war has already started, and it has acquired a multi-format, very unusual way of implementation, and it has not yet come to its hot stage. And we are gathering here asking the spirit of Yalta to help us to stop in time and not to allow this hot phase. And we can judge this looking at the wars which are happening around our country and at a larger scale. These wars are happening at the moment, and the role of the United Nations was not to let the World War happen. But I think when they were thinking about it in the 40s, they also tried to avoid regional conflicts, because they grew up into major conflicts, and the events which are happening in the southern Caucasus, in Karabakh, are actually showing us this. The world is involved into global instability, and taking into account the COVID pandemic, we are facing the economical and social crisis, and we are the initiators. We, I mean the Russian people. For us, it is more and more obvious that there is an aggression against what we call the Russian world. It's a conditional name of our civilization. It doesn't mean any ethnical, it's a civilizational meaning, where Russia is the biggest state around which, from the point of civilization, of culture, we gather the countries which are close to us. This world is under crisis, and Russia is trying to protect this peace, this world, and as it has always been subscribed to Russia, as Mr. Brzezinski, who was quoted here, that Russia should be cleaned from its allies and brothers, as it has happened with Ukraine and as it is happening with Belarus. And here we should see what is the root of this evil, and to analyze the possibilities of to avoid worsening of instability. As a state who has survived in the World War II, we are always speaking about the national sovereignty as the integrity, and we are trying to support the Russian world, which has been cut without any anesthesia, and we are trying to support this Russian-speaking world. But in my opinion, everything that is happening now is the result of dismembering the historical Russia, which happened 30 years ago, and which destroyed the balance which had been achieved in Yalta in 1945. And in my opinion, it's absolutely obvious that the separation into separate states of the historical Russian. Why I call it the historical Russian? It was called the USSR for some time, but it has been for the last several centuries a big country having all the characteristics of a civilization. And when it was split into several states, which was called in different ways, those states created their sovereignty, some of them from scratch. This dismembering was strategically not prepared, and politically and historically it was a mistake. And in many ways, in my opinion, it was a criminal act, and the majority of the newly created countries, which were the results of voluntaristic power of just 3 out of 15 member states, were a criminal act, and the result is showing today. We see a lot of conflicts, and it's very difficult to solve these conflicts, and many of these states are in the stage of this further dismembering, and it seems to me that such a situation is absolutely dissatisfactory and unacceptable. At the moment we have 5 states: Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Russia and Belarus, and 6 unacknowledged countries, and this is an unacceptable situation. It is absolutely unacceptable that the number of unacknowledged states is the same or more than the number of the acknowledged states. These are, first of all, the members of the Russian world who said, we want to be with our peoples. 25 million Russians were dismembered forcefully with their historical ways. We cannot say that they came there from some other places. They have always lived there. These are Donetsk, Lugansk, which did not agree with their country coming into an NATO bloc, the bloc which is calling Russia its enemy. This means that this bloc is hostile to us. They are the part of our nation. The same is happening in the Caucasus, where the people in Ossetia are saying that they would like to be within Russia, and we are waiting for someone to acknowledge them. Who will acknowledge them? Our opponents? In which interests they will acknowledge them? And how long can this world exist in such situation? It has been in such a situation for decades already, when they are in the situation of uncertainty and they are forced to become different, and our countrymen are forced to become subordinates or to change their identity. I think that this situation is unacceptable, and it has become the root of the problems and the acute aggravations of conflicts that appeared at the post-Soviet space. I would like once more to come back to the situation around Karabakh. In my opinion, it's incredibly dangerous situation because it can grow into an international conflict and civilizational conflict, because they are seeing that they are now attracting the gunmen, especially from the organizations which are believed to be terroristic organizations, and so this should not be allowed. So what's the root or problem of this conflict? The problem is that the United Nations has created 2 major principles, the territorial integrity and the right for self-determination, but it has not created a criteria which of these principles should be applied, when we should apply the territorial integrity principle and when we should apply the right for self-determination. And look at what is going on. When the Western world or NATO or the European countries believe that it is advantageous to them, they acknowledge the states like Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the unit of the 2 Germanys. And I have seen a wonderful film by Kondratyev, The Wall, and I recommend you to see it without any referendum. When the Germans are uniting, the whole world is applauding to them, at least the whole Western world. But when the Russians are uniting, when the Crimea says that we are the Russian land and has not acknowledged the state, the coup d'etat and the war and the ethnical cleaning, then the world doesn't accept it. How does it happen? And I would like to ask you this question to you, scientists and analytics, in which case we should apply the territorial integrity principle and try to keep this integrity whatever it costs, and in which case we should apply the right for self-determination, especially if we are speaking about ethnic minorities who are living in their ethnic land, and it seems to me that in the international practice the criteria should be the only one. If the rights, the human rights are violated, first of all, the right for life, the right for peace, if the whole ethnic group, especially an autonomous group, is facing the war, if they are not allowed to speak their language, if they are not allowed to follow their religious traditions, if they are forced to get assimilated, then in this case the right for self-determination should be applied in order to keep these people and to support the civilized ways of this national group to live. If the state completely respects all the human rights, language rights, educational rights of the mass media, and whether these people are involved in the management of their territory, and there is no threat of the assimilation and loss of identity, then of course we should speak about the territorial integrity principle. People say to us, you have a lot of national republics. Yes, but Russia cannot exist in any other form. We have to respect the rights of those people, neither in before the revolution, neither after it. No one was assimilated, and each people can keep their language and their mass media and their culture, and it was the same during the Tsar time, by the way, and those territorial unities were managed by the ethnic elites, and this is what allows us to go on. If those small territories split up, many of them will stop to exist, and it happened already. What happened with humans, with Khazars? They did not join this civilization, but the Tatars did, and the Mongols also were always attracted here. And we are living together. This is the way our state exists, and if you doubt that we will be able to keep up this integrity, we will not. We have already been in this integrity for many years, and many small ethnic units understand that they can only work, they can only survive in this unified civilization space. I will stop at the moment because we have the phone call. So how do I let it be heard in the hall? Yakov, hello, it is Georgy Muratov. I'm greeting you. Thank you very much for getting involved in our conference. I will suspend my speech. We would like to hear your assessment of the current situation and how it is influenced by the Yalta world order, and the world order which is being destroyed at the moment. We are all listening to you.
основные Ялтинские соглашения – это взаимное уважение и принятие национальных интересов государств, которые участвуются до этого договора. И именно взаимное принятие интересов этих государств и заложило базу для успеха. Когда начали разрушать, причем наглые группы, принципы Ялтинского соглашения, с этого момента мир все больше и больше скатывается к неустойчивости и к опасности войны. Как локальных войн, так и даже тотальной и Третьей мировой войны. Все проблемы, которые начались в мире с конца 80-х годов и трагедии, были именно из-за нарушения Ялтинских соглашений. Основа их, только если она будет прощена, то есть в многополярном мире учитываются интересы всех стран, а не одна страна предписывает всему миру, только тогда может быть начнется оздоровление мирового сообщества и окончание этих жестоких и бесполезных войн. Одна из таких войн сейчас вспыхнула опять в Карабахе. Войны на Ближнем Востоке, разрушение других государств. Это все могло быть предотвращено, если бы Ялтинские соглашения соблюдались. И пока они соблюдались в белом мире. Для того, чтобы Ялтинские соглашения были созданы и соблюдались, необходимо, чтобы у всех стран, которые участвуют в этом, было достаточно силы и достаточно мощи, чтобы защитить свои интересы и отстоять. Если бы Россия, если бы Советский Союз тогда был слаб, не было бы Ялтинских соглашений. Когда противники России посчитали, что Россия слаба, она слабее, и теперь можно с ней не считаться и проводить свою политику антироссийскую, они начали это делать. И только когда Россия начала усиливаться и восстанавливаться, только тогда этот процесс замедлился и полностью прекратился. То есть сильная, уверенная в себе Россия, которая может отстаивать свои национальные интересы, является залогом не только безопасности России, но и мира в других странах. И самый лучший пример это в Сирии. Как только Россия начала действовать в Сирии, она превратила в самый сильный стабилизирующий фактор на Ближнем Востоке. То же самое будет и в других частях света. И когда Россия, придя к правильным выводам после ошибок, сделанных в 2014 году, заняла более ответственную позицию по отношению к Беларуси, это сразу сказалось на результатах того, что происходит в Беларуси, и положило конец всем попыткам провести в Минске киевским лидером. Так что еще раз я хочу вам сказать, я считаю, что необходимо восстановление ялтинских принципов, необходимо изучение истории и принятие правильных исторических выводов. С восстановлением принципа Ялты и может быть восстановлен мир в мире и могут прекратиться или свестись на нет все локальные войны, от маленьких и уже некоторые больше. Еще раз вам больших успехов.
Спасибо, Яковлевич. Было очень интересно, хотя слышно плоховато, прямо скажу. Видимо, техника наша еще не дошла до такого уровня.
Я постараюсь сказать более четко и более ясно и более подробно, когда я наконец-то приеду в Крым. Последний раз я был в Крыму в месяце.
Мы вас очень ждем и всегда будем рады оказать гостеприимство такому прекрасному аналитику, практику во всех отношениях человеку уважаемому, в том числе и у нас в Крыму и в России в целом. Спасибо, Яковлевич. Спасибо. Будьте здоровы. Берегите себя.
Всего хорошего.
До свидания.
Thank you, Yakovets. It was very interesting, though it was hard to hear. Probably our technical devices are not that strong at the moment. We are always happy to meet you, to accept you to such a wonderful analyst and practitioner, and we respect you very much in the Crimea and in Russia as well. Thank you very much. Please stay healthy. Take care. The highlight Yakov Kermel made on Russia, and I think it's because Russia is that very unique civilization which, in my opinion, we don't have any other example of such civilizations in Russia. And there are some languages. I, for example, don't know the examples where Gascon language or Norman language or Bavarian language has been supported. They all have disappeared, but in our country, any national unity has the right to keep up their language and to create their schools. If the civilians ask create an application to create such a school, and you are welcome to learn these languages, and I believe that we should, and this is my offer, that we should make our input into the development of the scientific, geopolitical and diplomatic congress. We should offer the new wordings of the criteria of the dependency of these two principles, territorial integrity principle and right for self-determination. In my opinion, the most relevant example here is the right for self-determination of the Crimean nations. We didn't want to stay under the junta that came in power in Kiev, those who were ready to cleanse all the Russians and to cleanse the Crimea and force us to speak Ukrainian. And certainly the people of the Crimea said no. We are coming out of the Ukraine and we have the right to do so. Nobody wants to read laws and constitutions, but Clause 138, Clause 2 says that the Autonomous Republic of Crimea has the right to organize and to provide their own conferences, referendums. So there is no limitation to this in the constitution of Ukraine. If anyone knows the constitution of Ukraine, this part on the Crimea is incorporated as a separate part, which is going beyond the constitution of Ukraine, which is called a unitary state, and then all of a sudden there comes an autonomous Republic of the Crimea. It was a kind of like compromise to keep the Crimea within Ukraine. So the rest of the constitution does not apply to the Crimea. We are only under this part of the constitution, which is concerning the the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. This is the issue of political interests, and everybody knows that, at least the political allies all over the world know this pretty well. In West and East, from the USA to China, and if you accept it or if you don't accept it, this is your political choice, and we are speaking about fairness and the maintenance of human rights. The fact of free joining of the Crimea into Russia is the reunification and the moment when we return to the historical Tavrida. And for the Russian nation, very important senses of consolidation of the society around the national goals also became very obvious. The Crimea became the beacon on the way of restoring our voices to reunite the Russian world. Unfortunately, we should have done the telephone call in a better way, and I would like to ask the organizers to deduct this minutes from my time. The world of the past, the world which was called a great chess field with different labyrinths, how to protect Russia, how to protect Ukraine. We have already quoted all this, how to cleanse Russia. This is the main idea of Brzezinski. But this complex world has been simplified at the maximum level after the Ukrainian events. This is not only a chess game, but very, very simple game of draughtsman when you just you can just click the figure and it will fly away from the field. Whatever is happening is going to bring us to the loss of identities, both for Armenia and Azerbaijan. If they go on like this, they will both be lost. They will be involved other countries which will subordinate them. And if Russia has any interests in the Caucasus, we should take this into account. And we do have interests, especially in the northern Caucasus. And those peoples who did not join Russia have lost their identities in the northern Caucasus. It is not true that we have conquered them. Yes, there were some elements of forced enforcement, because there was no way to protect and save those nations, because they said that they had this long blood feud, and if you don't help us, we will just destroy each other. And that's why Russia involved there. They tried to separate them from each other in that fight, like a grown-up separates two fighting children. And that is how Russia is surviving and how it provides identity, and then it helps to save the identities to small ethnic groups. I often meet people from Chechnya, from Chechens and Cherkess from the Arabic world, and I let them meet with Chechens and Cherkess and they cannot speak their language. They speak Arabic or Turkish. So who has kept your identity? Who has brought you away into that world? We have autonomous republics, for example, those Cherkess nations and independent states in Caucasus, and 4 autonomous republics in the Russian Federation. They can only save their identity within the Russian Federation, because this is the way we exist. I should finish my speech. I am afraid I have run out of time, but if you allow me, I would like to ask, how do you see the situation, the development of the situation? I think that the COVID, the pandemic, is worsening the situation, and it's speeding it up in the global scale, and it is influencing everything. Look at what's going on in the United States of America, and because the world depends on them, and the development of the situation in the world depends on the United States, and they are playing the determining role in the world. Many people are speaking about the choice of the United States, but for me there is a difference between Republicans and Democrats, and I think that they have the same goal, to keep up the global supremacy, the global domination of the United States, but they have different ways of going there, and they understand that their main competitor is China, and even Democrats are ready to accept that, but they don't have the same strategy. They have different strategies in working with such a competitor. The Republicans would like to fight with such a competitor, but the Democrats believe that they first have to find some land which they can dominate. Probably it might be some Far Eastern and Siberian regions, and to provide with those very rich in resources regions, they can subordinate the parts of Russia which they are trying to destroy, and they hope that this will go on in accordance with the Soviet scenario. And for the Republicans, we have Republicans, we have Democrats, we have our Chinese friends who we are greeting especially, and we are facing some really tough times. And probably the only example of positive examples in all those tries to destroy Russia is the integration, which allows us to stop instability, and this integration with the Crimea and the words "it's our" and that's it, is the only way to keep the destroyers of to keep the integrity and to prevent the efforts to destroy Russia, to avoid the possibility to dominate over separate states and create some untraditional orientation for those states which are not characteristic of the people who live there. But it is well known that as the untraditional orientation among people comes to an end with the inability to bring children into this world, the same happens with the states which are deprived of their identity. And I would like to introduce this into our documents as well. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Muradov. I think that the emotional potential has been given to this dialogue and discussion, and we will go on. We will finish this session in about 15 minutes, then we'll have a break. And we will have 15 minutes break in the next room. At the balcony, you will get a feeling of this wonderful place. And Mr. Muradov has spoken at a strong emotional way. But we can remember that each member of the Yalta Conference had their own preferences for Stalin. The priority was the end of war and reparations, and for Roosevelt it was the future world and the war with Japan. For Churchill, the painful point was Poland and the reparations, and he was very emotional, speaking about the losses the British nation has suffered during the war, and Stalin stopped him in a very easy way. With all the losses of the British nation, it cannot be compared with what the Soviet people have suffered. And today, when we started, just imagine the atmosphere when these three people were here in Yusupolsky, in Fransovsky Palace, and you have seen the wonderful atmosphere around this wonderful nature of the Crimea. It was the same 75 years ago, and it will be the same in the future. But then they visited Sevastopol and they saw the awful destroyment of this city, and each of them had come through Sevastopol, and then they reunited here, and it's very important for us to remember this. And before I give floor to our next speaker, we have a question. We have 2 words. No, this person has already spoken. Okay, thank you. And let me give floor to the president of the social diplomacy, Rima Rezainova.
Экономической и политической системой.
Thank you.
И мы по праву гордимся исторической победой официальной дипломатии.
Hello.
Сегодня дипломатия, как
The best thing we could do
процессов и явлений, переживает
is not to read this report among those wonderful speeches. I took off my mask, I opened the eyes, and I have learned so many things I can tell other people. And I compared this atmosphere with Turkey, which is being distorted with a lot of problems, many of which have not been voiced yet. 75 years ago, here was laid the platform for the communication of countries with different cultures, religions, economies and political systems. And we are rightly proud of this victory of the international diplomacy. Today, the diplomacy is being in crisis. The number of military conflicts is growing, and it's hard to find ways in many long-term negotiations. And though financial and diplomatic efforts, we are working among the negative processes in the international community. And what are those people for whom we are working? The people are trying to survive among the illnesses, the unemployment, the military and political and social conflicts. The people have identical conflicts and freedom problems. And the new nations cannot survive in the competition with long-established neighbors. And the interests of financial magnates are paying for the destroyment and violations, and many emotional, physical, financial and natural resources are being wasted. And we are surprised that the political and economical changes. I am concerned about what we are giving to our younger generations. We have ecological catastrophes coming up, we have wars, and we have lost peace because it is infected with the virus of ignorance. We have seen we are trying to give as heritage to our young people the culture and peace. To stop the war means to take the responsibility for our planet. Each person should take that responsibility and to focus on peaceful processes. And we have advantages against advantages over official diplomacy. Each person who is going abroad should feel him or herself as a representative, as a diplomat, as an ambassador of his or her country. And this is a natural event, and we always judge about other countries by the people we know from those countries, how this person is showing his or her traditions. And only after that we try to find some new information. Stop influencing our minds from the TV boxes. Let us listen to silence and try to understand what the 95 normal people in this planet want. They want peace. The peace whose fate was determined here 75 years ago. People are working for ratings and they are not caring about giving other people for that. We should... How long can we use those people? And only those 5% of people are dreaming about getting a medal at the battlefields. And the diplomacy should not manipulate, but it should help, and it should wisely use the resources. And none of the countries have actually solved this issue. This is the moment when the social and cultural diplomacy has much more opportunities than the official diplomacy. It can come into any house, it sees the situation from within, and it has a wonderful advantage. It is soft, it is very natural, and it knows what it wants. It wants to protect its children and its culture. It is an important reserve of each country, and unfortunately this kind of very successful diplomacy is developing not thanks to but despite of. And it is very important to give us real support of professionals and not to leave it to foreign leaders. Please use this way of practical way of uniting people. This kind of diplomacy is creating better ways of communication between people, and the consequences of any conflict is always laid on people. who will help us to overcome. We have seen that we need everyday work in the field, and we should work with people as they are motivated, most of all. The Russian language is our tool of international communication. It's the way of communication with the motherland, and it's the tool to know Russia better. Each foreigner who has learned the Russian language is connected with Russia forever. He can get the information from Russia, and he can create his own view of what's going on, and this person cannot be zombified by ideological untruth. And we should, we, your countrymen, should keep up the motivation to learn the Russian language, to provide Olympiads in Russian language, for the Olympiads in Russian language, for Russian literature, Russian history among the bilingual children living outside Russia. We managed to gather 28 cities for such Olympiad, and we know that such an Olympiad is also provided in China, but we don't have the common final game. Those children will grow up to become the ambassadors of peace for us. 75 years ago, the Crimea became the epicenter of the new way of life. Today, it's a small model of the world, where everything has happened, what could have happened at our small planet. And the historical conference should revise the global processes and very cautiously open up the door into the future and assess the potential of the world in this hard period. Everyone has his own attitude to this wonderful place. For me, it's very precious remembrance. From this land, my grandfather was drawn to the front, and he was young and handsome, and he died in 1945 in Leningrad. And every time I remember about him, I put a piece of bread on a shot of vodka, and I pray for peace. And those who live abroad and who still remember the sufferings of the World War II, we sing our songs, we remember the countries of the CIS countries, the USSR, and on the 9th of May we march and we pay our tributes to those who died during the World War II. And we're proud of it, and we see the admiration of other people. And this allows us to show the unanimity with the world. In Artek, here in Crimea, there is a school of young diplomats, and at least some children can come there and can become friends of our country for the rest of their lives. It's important to keep up with the international student flow, to accept foreigners to be students here, and it's very important to promote our projects not only through diplomacy but also with the scientific ways. And today we have learned a lot about the diplomacy and the victories of diplomacy, and it's very symbolic that we are gathered here at the Crimea land, which is multinational, and Here a new wonderful project was born, the Academy of People's Diplomacy. And I address my colleagues and scientists in this hall. Whatever you're doing is very important for the history. But what the people's diplomacy is doing is aimed at the perspective. We will be happy to share the common experience and let us work together and let us teach each other. People's diplomacy needs the scientific part to become more and more successful. Our generation who knew the World War II, thanks to the stories we heard from the participants, is going away, and the new generations will only be able to learn about it from the textbooks. We are already late with preparing new textbooks, with sharing our experience, and we should in all ways try to keep up our great historical motherlands, and we should always share the memory of those who have died for it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Rimo? Those reports, those speeches which we have not heard yet, we will start with them at 2 o'clock. The fourchette will be at the same place where we had breakfast, on the ground floor. And in the end, I would like to quote a very important idea in the memoirs of Andrei Gromyko. He remembers when the United Nations was founded, why did we suffer such huge losses? And I just remember these 5 basic goals. We were speaking, so they were fighting for freedom, for independence, for safety, for peace, for the rights and dignity of a human being. It was voiced in 1945, and for happiness, happiness and fairness. Can you imagine this formula? It is very precise, it's very multicultural. So, a few words from you, dear colleagues. I'm sorry, but I will have to leave you till tomorrow because I'm being called to Simferopol. Thanks God they have liberated our sailors in Nigeria, who were detained by pirates. They stayed there for several months and they suffered, and their relatives were suffering here. And I have to leave this conference, but tomorrow I will be happy to join you in the afternoon. The Academy of People's Diplomacy is organized by the Sevastopol State University, and if tomorrow I happen to be in Sevastopol, I will say hello from you to them. But you're right, that scientific diplomacy, science and diplomacy at the state level, especially at this stage, should take every effort to unite for peace, for safety, and for the restoration of cooperation, which was replaced with confrontation due to some reasons, because there are some important events in history, and we would like to, as we tried to level up the pandemic so that there were no peaks where everything can be broken. In the same way, we should fight for peace, and with the help of all the forces involved in this process, we hope that we will be able to level up this exponent and to go through this peak pressure in our world and get back to cooperation, to safety and peace.